Hey, this is Todd. I had a great conversation with Daniel from Bandit's Keep on his channel on Tuesday. Something came up that I thought was worth addressing as its own thing apart from that conversation. I do think our conversation was fun, and I will link to that in the show notes if you'd like to check out the full hour-long chat that we had. But what I'd like to talk about right now is the concept of languages and culture. A big part of the classic gaming experience, the OSR experience, is when you create a character. Depending on your intelligence score, you get a number of languages known in addition to common, the lingua franca that tends to be spoken throughout whichever realm you're playing. And those languages can be Draconic or Goblin or Giant or any languages that your game world supports or the campaign that you're in supports. Normally, whenever I see these or whenever I've used them, I've really just considered them in terms of just the language. Hey, you speak Goblin, but that's it. During the conversation with Daniel, I think it might have been something he said, but it dawned on me that we could really expand what it means. When you think about learning a language, it's more than just learning the language. It's learning at least something about the culture. If you think classically, if you're in school now, or you remember when you were in school and you took a second language, you didn't just learn a bunch of the vocabulary and the words and that was it. Part of the coursework is always about the culture, because the culture informs the language in just the way that it's constructed and also in how that language is used. There's always more to it than just the words. Maybe if you're learning Latin, and I took Latin for a year and I don't remember much of those classes, maybe if you learn Latin, you really just learn about the language. But basically everything else, a large part, is the actual vocabulary and the rules and of the grammar and everything else, but also culture. In terms of a fantasy, medieval style fantasy setting, you have to think that if you're learning Goblin or similar language, how are you learning it? How is this character learning Goblin? It wasn't imprinted on their brains at birth. We don't have access to the machines like in the Matrix where you can jack in and something just inserts a file into your brain. You know, Goblin, 1 gigabyte download, boop, done. Someone's got to teach it to you. That someone is either a Goblin or someone who's one step removed from being a Goblin. Either way, one can imagine that during coursework, study, apprenticeship, whatever it is, that it's not just the vocabulary that's being taught. You're being taught about the culture of the goblins, what goblins think are important, how goblin societies tend to operate, what the religion of goblins might be, because all this stuff informs the language. It informs the customs. If you're going to greet a goblin, how do you greet them? That's not necessarily just a language thing, but it's something that if you are learning Goblin for practical purposes, you're learning Goblin not just to write a textbook on here's the dictionary of Goblin to common, but presumably you're learning it to actually use out in the wider world, then it totally makes sense that you need to know more than just the vocabulary. You need to know, well, if I go to shake a Goblin's hand, does he see that as a sign of friendship or at least neutrality, or are they going to take it to some kind of insult because it's similar to a stabbing motion and they're gonna take that aggressively? All these things are important. Why do I say all this? Well, I say all this because we can use this as GMs in our games to transmit some of the lore about these different creatures to our players. When the party, a party of adventurers enters an area with goblins in it, if anybody speaks Goblin, they don't just speak Goblin, they know things about Goblin culture. We can use this to build up context. This means that if they start running into traces of Goblin encampments, for example, let's say they find a Goblin camp, they're not there at the moment, but they were there recently, someone who speaks Goblin, maybe we could think about now as someone who has Goblin experience or affinity, might notice things even beyond the tracks of A, were these goblins? B, maybe some bit of the nature of that camp. Oh, these were hunters, these were gatherers, these were scavengers, these were raiders. I could tell that because of the way they've set up their camp. Think about Obi-Wan when he's schooling Luke about sand people versus stormtroopers in the first Star Wars movie. They go back to Aunt Beru's place, and Obi-Wan is able to look at the tracks and say, no, these aren't sand people. Sand people always walk single file to hide their numbers, and look at these shots. They're too exacting. We could say that comes down to their lore knowledge of sand people. They know that sand people like to walk single file, and they know that sand people just shoot. They're not precise tactical shooters. That would translate in a sense as somebody having that lore, affinity, whatever you want to call it, for goblins. It's not just you speaking goblin. It's you knowing lore about goblins, and then we can feed to that particular character, or multiple characters if they take it, lore about goblins. The other thing it does is it encourages players to look at different creatures as ones they might want to invest this slot, if you will, in there, right? Okay, I have whatever intelligence, I'm gonna get common, I'm gonna get 2 more languages. So we think of like languages, we probably want to think the ones that maybe we'll use most often in a social setting. But if we look at it more like lore, if we're looking at it more like, well, what do we know a lot about? That encourages maybe to think further afield. Maybe I don't care about, say, talking to giants, but because of the campaign or the adventure, maybe we're playing against the giants, something of that sort. Suddenly me having some cultural knowledge of giants is something I would want as a character, even if I don't think I'm going to actually talk much to the giants. We're just going to go in there and kick their butts and leave. But if it gives me some insight into how they operate, how their homesteads work, what their holidays are, what things they like, what things they don't like, what kind of pets they have, all these other things, it's something that becomes a much more interesting, important feature that we can lean on. And we're not adding any more mechanics. We're not adding any more mechanics to the game. We're simply looking at that languages and just turning it into something a little bit greater, which again to me makes sense, because maybe now we can learn a language and use it totally, learn it completely divorced from the culture from which it came, right? We could pick up an app on our phone and say, okay, we're going to play this game where we're going to learn Spanish, and it's not going to tell us anything about Spanish culture. But I think historically, how did people learn those languages? They learned it by either having a lot of access to someone who had been embedded in the culture, or being embedded in that culture themselves. So let's use that. And then from a player standpoint, besides whatever benefits we might feel like we're getting, ooh, I want to know about the culture of goblins because I think we're going to face a lot of goblins coming up. It's also a backstory tool. It's a way of saying this character grew up in a situation in which they had contact with someone who was either a goblin themselves or very close to goblins. And we could think about, well, that might have been a trader. Maybe you lived in a frontier town and you dealt directly with some groups of goblins, or you had an uncle or an employer or a teacher who was one of those people. Maybe you were kidnapped and you grew up some amount of time with goblins. And instead of that coming out and just being a backstory thing, we can just look at it and say, hey, you invest one of your languages, or we can call it cultural affinities. I don't know what term we would use for. We use some kind of term to say, yes, this represents some experience of my character with that culture. And one benefit is, yes, I speak the language, but the other benefit is, hey, I have insight into their culture. I know something about them. And then as GMs, we can use that in our games. Let me know what you think. Other than that, have a great rest of your day, night, weekend, whenever you're watching or listening to this. Hey, before I go, if you like this stuff, if you can give me a thumbs up, helps me out a lot. If you enjoy my content, subscribing is great. I am supported by folks on Patreon and Coffee and elsewhere. If you feel like, hey, I'd like to help the channel out in one of those avenues, I have links always in the show notes and description. But peace out, everybody. Game on. Talk to you later.